For being here. I'm really thrilled to bring together this wonderful group to discuss issues of social movements, identity, and resistance in Nicaragua today. I'll try to be brief. So after years of peace and being seen as an island of stability and security in comparison to the neighboring Northern Triangle countries, Nicaragua returned to global headlines in April 2018 when the government responded to protests against public pension cuts by beating and killing demonstrators, sparking a wave of mass nationwide popular mobilization and a harsh crackdown by police and pro-government paramilitaries, who killed hundreds, wounded, tortured, and imprisoned thousands, while thousands more people fled abroad for safety. The decade before 2018 had seemed fairly stable from the outside, as former revolutionary leader Daniel Ortega returned to the presidency in 2007, bringing leftist rhetoric and ties to Venezuela, but keeping neoliberal economic policies. Ortega's government, however, also brought suppression of women's and LGBTQ rights, increasing colonization of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities' lands, and erosion of democratic institutions. The 2016 elections, when First Lady Rosario Murillo became vice president, explicitly opened the door to creating a new dynasty in Nicaragua. And the 2018 lethal repression brought the Ortega-Murillo family's authoritarianism into full view. Nicaraguans now also face the COVID-19 pandemic and the task of rebuilding after hurricanes Eta and Iota. Faith in the government may be low for most people, but Nicaraguans have strong communities and, despite government efforts, a resilient civil society to which they can turn. The political opposition remains fragmented ahead of the scheduled 2021 elections, which few people expect to be fair anyways, but Nicaraguan social movements, communities, and activists will continue to organize, advocate, and plan for a better, freer future. To discuss all of these issues and more, we have a great lineup of speakers. Cristina Awadala is a graduate student in the Department of Sociology at UCSB, conducting dissertation research on the Ortega-Murillo regime's aesthetics, on collective memory, and feminist analyses of the state. She also recently published an article on the government's management or mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic in the latest issue of NACLA Report. Emilia Yang is an artist, activist, and scholar, currently completing her PhD in media arts and practice at the University of Southern California, focusing on using art, media, technology, and public interventions for political action. She's published and exhibited her work in various venues, and she directs the Museo de la Memoria contra la Impunidad, working with the Asociación Madres de Abril to preserve the memory of victims of government repression since 2018 and to seek accountability. Jennifer Gett is Associate Professor of Comparative Politics and Cultures at Michigan State University, a cultural anthropologist. She works on and with indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in Nicaragua and elsewhere in Central America, focusing on struggles to defend land and impacts of state violence and racialized policing. Her book, Black Autonomy, Race, Gender, and Afro-Nicaraguan Activism was published by Stanford University Press in 2016, and she's currently conducting research with Nicaraguan asylum seekers in Costa Rica and the US, while also providing expert testimony for asylum cases. Mateo Jarquin is Assistant Professor of History at Chapman University, and his work examines how revolutions in the Global South have shaped debates about development, democratization, and international relations. And his current book project uses archival research and interviews in multiple Latin American countries to provide a new lens on the Nicaraguan Revolution and Civil War in transnational perspective. Mateo has published work in several journals and edited volumes, including the recent Flaxo volume on Nicaragua, Anhelos de un Nuevo Horizonte. So each of our presenters will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're very pleased to have comments and initial questions from Charlie Hale, who's the Dean of Social Sciences at UCSB and a longtime activist scholar working on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua and on indigenous and Afro-descendant communities' rights in Latin America. We'll then have an open question and answer period. You can submit questions in the Q&A tab after the presentations, and I'll keep track of them and ask them to the speakers. Se puede hacer preguntas en español también. If there are technical issues during the talks, you can also ask those in the Q&A, and we'll try to deal with them. So with all that said, we will now turn to Cristina Awadala. Cristina, take us away.
Okay, so hi, thanks everyone. I just want to start by thanking all the folks who made this event possible, fellow panelists, and everybody in attendance. And I hope my screen it's a PDF PowerPoint, so it might be a little awkward, but as Professor Thaler said, I'm a 5th year grad in the Department of Sociology, and I am, or have largely been interested in the sort of capacity of the aesthetics of the Ortega-Murillo state to constitute a sort of totalitizing worldview that is used to achieve and maintain hegemony. And so I want to look at, Nicaraguan feminist critiques and how they can tell us about, new forms of authoritarianism as evidenced or seen through the Ortega-Murillo state. And so by aesthetics, I mean the symbols and, there we go. The symbols and myths, discourses, rituals, art, etc., that reflect a sort of syncretic politics of the Ortega-Murillo state, which is one of that draws from esotericism, traditional gender regimes, religious moral codes, and the memory of the 1979 revolution. And we see this aesthetic in the public sphere and in art like the Árboles de la Vida, which are those big metal colorful trees, political propaganda such as billboards, mass rallies where everyone wears the same shirt and constitute a sort of indistinguishable mass, and discourses by the presidential couple that praise God, exalt the traditional nuclear family, and constitute a sort of historical revisionism. And so these are some examples of speeches made by Rosario. And so I won't be focusing so much on this because I like to explore more how feminists are formulating analyses of this aesthetic and express these through ideological critiques and their activism. And so I'm in my early dissertation period. And so some of this sort of work has been informed through my MA, which was a pilot study, and I interviewed feminists, and I'm looking primarily at urban feminism, feminists located in and around Managua, and I look to the feminist movement as oppositional political actors, in part because of their long-standing autonomous and critical relation to the state. Feminist critiques, I see them as causing crises of narrativity for the regime. They pose challenges to the reproduction of social relations when they call into question the sort of contradictions or gulf between the discourse of the state and the actual reality of things. And I think that by looking at this feminist movement, this urban feminism, which is, just one form of feminism in Nicaragua, we can see how the Ortega-Murillos have managed dissent to better understand how they manage crises. And I think that's relevant to our understanding of the crisis or the ongoing socio-political crisis today as well as, it can contribute to building our understandings of the role of ideology and new forms of authoritarianism. So a little bit about the aesthetics, just to ground these critiques, is, these aesthetics can be seen as a sort of manifestation of the pacts Ortega made to return to power. And so, he had to accommodate powerful social sectors, such as the Catholic hierarchy. And this was marked by a draconian abortion ban and in 2005. And the Ortega-Murillo aesthetic, takes a social crisis, assaults on reproductive rights and rampant sexual abuse against girls, which has in part is in part related to the abortion ban, which has resulted in sort of like a compulsory motherhood for a lot of girls in Nicaragua, and turns it into a sort of perverse celebration for political propaganda. One rather horrid example was like in 2011, Murillo exploited the rape and pregnancy of an 11-year-old indigenous girl from Huilpa Sixa, which is in the militarized northern Atlantic region, to make it part of a pro-life campaign during Ortega's re-election campaign. And La Compañera said, and I quote, "The government is giving testimony to our commitment with life, with the family, and with the religious culture, the Christian values, with that culture of faith and love for the Nicaraguan majorities." And so because of the gender and Catholic codes that are embedded in this aesthetic, this political culture has had dire impacts on the life chances of girls and women. And from the beginning, feminists have decried Ortega's sexual abuse of his stepdaughter, rising authoritarian tendencies they noticed back during the revolutionary period. You have feminists like Sofia Montenegro, referring to Daniel and his terceristas faction as duchistas, in reference to Mussolini. And so Ortega's return begins with an assault on reproductive rights. And I think this shows us how gender, patriarchy, and authoritarianism are all co-articulated in Nicaragua. When talking about the Ortega-Murillo political culture with feminists, or when I have looked at sort of documents or art they've created, they definitely, articulate this sort of these linkages. And this is a lot of text, but these are just some snippets or examples of ideological critiques. And so in an interview in 2017 with Dora Maria Tees, she said, "The worst thing about the imaginary of the Ortega-Murillo family is the complicity in cases of sexual abuse, right? And the patriarchy that dominates over the family with authoritarianism as the model. I think that this is completely nefarious. And on the other hand, the fact that if a family is legitimately in power at the national level, that also legitimizes the caudillismo of families in the home and locality." There's a quote from Sochi, who who does feminist street art, and she links her sort of activism to reclaiming the public sphere, both from political propaganda, but also from patriarchal violence. And so I think we, through some of these examples of critiques, we see how, they represent a sort of counter-hegemonic discourse that rereads the state's imaginary to reveal how the normalization of patriarchal dominance in the family, facilitated through these religious codes and family values, is central for the naturalization of concentration of power amongst the Ortega-Murillo family at the summit of political power. I'd also like to note that as feminists, call out this critique, they sort of cause crises or ruptures in the state's sort of vision or imposition that everything is normal, that everything is that Nicaraguan families live in peace, et cetera. And so Through their activism, feminists contest state policies of forgetting violence and other things, that are marked behind discourses of family unity and reconciliation by bearing witness to privatized violence in the public sphere. And so the sort of cosmeticized public sphere and the regime's self-image that suggests Nicaragua lives in the second stage of the revolution, where families live in peace thanks to this sort of divine Christian socialist solidarity leadership of El Comandante. This all becomes tainted and is called into question as feminists go into the streets to denounce the state's complicity in gender-based violence, or declare that la violencia machista reproduce dictaduras, or that patriarchal violence reproduces dictators. And so these are some examples of feminist activism that intervenes in the public sphere, and has long been articulating this sort of vinculations between authoritarianism and the status of women and girls in Nicaragua, as well as resisting state controlling images through self-articulation, through activism. And this is actually a quote at the bottom, I forgot the marks, but this is from a compañera from the Movimiento Autónomo de Mujeres. She said, "The feminist movement of Nicaragua has been one of the, and I say this without a doubt, one of the movements that has had profound analyses over reality. Yes, it has warned and given testimony to what could occur." But she also went on to say that she felt that, feminists were largely ignored because of misconceptions around feminism, and that is in part informed by the state's sort of anti-feminism. And so for their tradition of vocal dissent, they've long been subject to repression and delegitimating strategies. Feminists have been repressed by police at marches, have had offices raided, accused of money laundering, experienced harassment by police, and so many other forms of repression. But the state has also managed dissent in the symbolic realm by mobilizing sort of culturally resonating frames, such as calling feminists contras in dresses, as Murillo did in 2006 in a treatise she wrote about how feminism is a bourgeois imperialist ideology, or as one participant said, calling feminists lesbians who want to do away with the family in order to delegitimize feminisms and their critiques. And that sort of management has been present and helps us, I think, understand the 2018 or the crisis that began in 2018, where protesters were, automatically washed over as golpistas, and or folks who have called for social distancing due to the COVID-19 pandemic have been called extremists with a fake news apparatus. So to me, this tells me that aside from the direct consequences of the Ortega-Murillo state's pacts and its aesthetics on the life chances of women and girls, this political culture has also had consequences to Nicaragua's fragile democracy, because its anti-feminism is in part a reaction to critiques raised against the state, which challenge its legitimacy. And so by attacking the movement, by stoking anti-feminism, the Ortega-Murillos have largely been able to bypass critique and manage contradictions. And so I think I'm approaching the end of my time, and there's a lot more I'd like to say in regards to constructions of new memories, but I think someone or folks like Amelia Yang can really take us there. But to close, I wanted to note a quote from The Dawn We Know the Day, which was from one of my participants. She said, who was talking about this sort of, these histories of abuses of power amongst Ortega, and how it's not quite shocking where we are now, I guess. And but yeah, I hope that at least to some degree I've been able to show how, you know, a feminist analysis of the Ortega-Murillo aesthetic shows us how hegemony is achieved, how social relations are produced, but also how patriarchy and authoritarianism are mutually constituted in Nicaragua. That these ideological critiques, these feminist counter-hegemonic discourses, memories, and imaginaries that are rooted, you know, in their historical sort of tradition of autonomy and critical posturing towards the state, as well as a sort of institutionalized counter-memory, decode these dominant discourses and challenge the state's imaginary while also envisioning new forms of social relations. And I think, yeah, when through the inclusion of feminist discourses, or when we look at feminist resistance, we see that the uprisings of 2018 were not necessarily something spontaneous, that for years, social movements organizing not just around the Ortega-Murillo's assaults on women's rights, but its anti-Blackness, its perpetuation of colonization, its dispossession of campesinos and indigenous people, and the destruction of the environment. There have long been movements and other folks who have been critiquing the state, and so when this is just one example of that tradition, but it also, I think, expands our understandings of new authoritarianisms and the sort of role of ideology in maintaining hegemony. So yeah, that's what I'd like to say. And let me see if I can get my thumbnail back up so I can put myself on mute. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Christina. And now we'll turn to Emilia.
Thank you. Thanks, Christina, for your presentation. I'm very excited about your research. Let me just share my screen. Do you see it? Cool. Okay. Yeah. As Kai introduced me, my name is Emilia Yang. I'm a PhD candidate in media arts and practice. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I will share with you what I have been working since the Nicaraguan uprisings that kind of thread my activism, my art, and scholarship. Just to highlight, I guess everybody knows the context that has been happening, but just to highlight that in 2018, in December, the interdisciplinary group of experts, the GA for Nicaragua, that was selected by the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights, described the repressive actions of the government as crimes against humanity. It is presumed that there's been 325 lethal victims of the violence, but we know that the human rights organizations were kicked out, and to the point that there's many of them that don't even have offices. One of the things that government has done is that they have denied the existence of the victims of state violence, denied the right to mourn, and declare kind of like a war against the memory of those that have been killed. There's a violent dispute over public spaces that prevents the constructions of memory marks or memorials in the urban space. Their lives became unrecognized, devalued, and therefore ungrievable, as Judith Butler would say. And the violence on the victims' lives spread to their death, stripping their families of the necessary rituals of mourning. And funerary rituals that are important in the elaboration of mourning could not be carried out in peace, since they were objects of terror and threats. On many occasions, the families did not have to pay for the coffin or the land in the cemetery, so the government offered money for their silence, and if they did not accept the money, they would become targets. Sometimes they couldn't perform the wakes, and because sometimes there were paramilitary groups outside, and in the burials, there was little participations of members of the community because people were afraid to go and be attacked. This prevented the families from having support networks to process their grief. There are stories of desecrated tombs, and I believe that as a result of this, the grieving process remains kind of like pending, traversed by the absence of justice. In response to the repression phase, the families of the victims assassinated created an organization called Asociación Madres de Abril, Association Mothers of April. Its acronym in Spanish is AMA, which means love. And the main objective is fight together for truth and justice. I am one of the members of the organization. I'm part of the Memory Commission because my uncle, Vicente Rapacholi, he was assassinated on June 26th while he was passing a barricade controlled by paramilitaries, and his case continues in impunity. And as you may imagine, all these events made me reorient my work and resources, becoming engaged as a militant of this group, aligning my dissertation project with our collective goals. I include the personal here to position my work and myself. The autobiographical example, Sadie Herman would say, it's really about trying to look at historical and social process and one's own formation as a window into social and historical process as an example of them. And I include the personal here to tell a story of engaging and countering the violence of abstraction. So my dissertation is practice-based, hybrid in form, bringing together, as I said, my activist and artistic endeavor with critical and scholarly analysis. The active construction of memory is part of the organization's central objective, as stated in the manifesto released on November 2018, that it was called Manifesto for Truth, Justice, and Integral Reparations. And driven by this objective, we created Ama en Olvida, the Museum of Memory Against Impunity. And what the museum does is that it disputes the official narrative that criminalizes citizens who participated in the civic protest as a way to challenge the climate of impunity that the regime wants to install. As Christina said, the victims were called many, many adjectives and names. So we created the museum with a human rights participatory approach in which the members of the association assume as an essential role in the design, collection of information, and presentation of the museum while we were still in mourning and the repression continues. It was carried out with the support of the Nicaraguan Academy of Sciences, the Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights, CENID, and a multidisciplinary technical team that included sociologists, architects, human rights defenders, psychologists, artists, designers, and archivists. And the organization recognizes the museum as a form of community organizing towards a path of transformation. I'm going to tell briefly a little bit about the story of how we did the museum. We collected the information in 2 moments. There was a collective session in which the relatives of the victims mapped and narrated the events in which our loved ones were assassinated, their home, wherever they were killed, then where the funerals were held, and the main times and routes between the events. Because as you know, there hasn't been any investigation. So this was also adding to the objective of finding out the truth of what happens. We use clandestine networks to hold these reunions. This is an example of what the maps look like. And then we turn them into traditional cartography to have more like collective vision of what happened in each territory. We did individual sessions that consisted of interviews and collection of photographic archive and memory objects of the victims. We usually interview 2 or 3 people, and as you can see in the pictures, the whole organization is led by women. We did these portraits that were demanding for justice, and casually this family, which is the Montenegro family, has been the target of so much repression these days, and maybe I'll have more time to tell about their story, but basically they have 4 people assassinated by the government, and the 2 sons of them are currently political prisoners. They're from Ortega, from Huihuili. We held 20 collective workshops and interviewed more than 200 relatives of 80 victims in 6 months. And this participatory model that recognizes and centers the knowledge of the victims has implied many challenges, as you can imagine. One of them was to ensure a theoretical methodological approach based on the acknowledgement of victims as subjects of rights, avoiding any re-victimization, to think of care as a problem of thought, and to compile the information where we're still mourning and the repression continues. We held these devolution workshops where we presented them kind of like the design of the museum to the family members, and their feedback was collective. And in these workshops, we also carry out games and theatrical exercises with the aim of knowing the future vision of the families around the theme of justice. For the design of the museum, we carry out a lot of research on the aesthetics we wanted to represent, and we used the organic way in which families remember and that they co-live with the memories of our loved ones. In Nicaragua is a very religious country, so people use altars. For me, the altar has this gesture of memory, of lighting up a candle, putting up a flower, of giving love to the memory of their loved one. And we did this website in which you can all go, museodelamemoria.nicaragua.org, where you can see who the victims were, what happened to them, and the continuation search for justice and the construction of memory and parts of family and the people of Nicaragua. So each victim has their own profile there. And as part of the kind of launch of this virtual museum, we also did a physical exhibition. And in the exhibition, we try also to show who the people were, basically the student, workers, artisans, indigenous people, peasants, producers, and political prisoners who made use of their citizen right to protest, and how the state assassinated them. And the exhibition had great reception and impact. It opened to citizens the possibility of having experience in the museum. And there was an interaction between the victims' families, which generated a lot of empathy and recognition from the visitors. We had more than 10,000 visits in 3 months, and the installation site, and more than 25,000 virtual visits, a lot of coverage. This is one of the rooms. And then people could go into also in the computer and see the virtual museum. And because there's no space in Nicaragua to do any type of protest, it was a place of gathering and a place of creation. We also held 5 workshops in which the families created embroideries for memory. And this is an image of one of the days that we were protesting around December. And also to have like a itinerant exhibition, because we want for people to experience this outside of Nicaragua. And we cannot move, obviously, the objects, the artifacts. We created this kind of like mixed reality experience that it's developing right now, with like a whole photogrammetry process in which we scan all the objects, and we have these 3D versions of the altars that we made for the exhibition with the objects of the people, the victims, and also telling the story of these objects, what they meant to the family and what they meant to the victims. And the museum has grown a lot, and I will not go through all the things that we're doing, but these are some of the projects that we have been working on through the year to continue kind of struggling for the recognition and for constructing memory together. And basically the museum exhibition and other projects help to share the grief and mourning practices that have been private, almost in hiding, and make them public, to answer the question, what can we do with all this pain? Our collective answer has been, we can collectivize grief, we can collectivize love, and we can collectivize healing. Memory has been a collective path for resisting and caring for life. In my writing, I'm trying to finish my dissertation, and I have been critically thinking about the project and how the victim families became activist media makers by sharing and representing their memories of violence through these kind of like many transmedia practices, and how through participatory design, we choose how to present the memories, how to portray our relatives, and how the memories became public. I argued that memory practice served AMA as a political organizing tool, as a human rights learning process, as we confronted together the question on how to challenge impunity and transform the pain into a demand of justice, truth, and reparations. And I am also developing ideas about how the museum, but especially its exhibition, generated an effective community with a larger audience that also took ownership of the grievance we made and the political implications of such community. Thank you very much. And now I let Kai.
Thanks so much, Emilia. And now we'll go to Jennifer.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today, and particularly to learn about the amazing activism and research of the other panelists. I want to thank Kai for inviting me to participate. So I've spoken and written a lot about Nicaragua since April 2018, and I think that my thoughts and feelings have changed and shifted over time. But my early response was, I have to admit, sort of a confusing mix of horror and hope. Horror at the violence that the state unleashed on the public, which Emilia has so beautifully characterized in her presentation. And my usual kind of hopeful excitement that I feel whenever I witness any form of mass mobilization against repression. In the early months of the crisis, I was particularly motivated as somebody who lives in the United States and who is from the US to write against widespread misrepresentations of the civic uprising. These narratives generally identified two sides to the conflict and defined them in binary terms as good or bad, left or right, civic or violent, dictatorship or democracy, and so on. The binaries were reproduced in the media, both mainstream and alternative, and by academics and government officials, and other folks as well. In the US, analysts on the left frequently interpreted the crisis as a product of a bad US-backed soft coup against a good revolutionary socialist state, whereas mainstream media and US government officials framed the crisis as a standoff between a bad authoritarian left and a good democratic civil society, I should say neoliberal civil society. These narratives were accompanied by an ongoing effort to co-opt the crisis by the Republican Party in the US, which has been, I guess, at least partially successful in some sense with the emergence of the so-called MAGA Nica. In my own experiences of working with the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice's Latin American Task Force in Ann Arbor, Michigan, solidarity with Nicaragua was, I hate to say it, but somewhat tepid. Not so much because members didn't care about Nicaraguans, they did. Many of these individuals have longstanding engagements with progressive social movements in Mexico and Central America, like the Zapatistas and the Honduran resistance that formed after the 2009 coup. They also did not support Ortega-Murillo government, like some solidarity in the organizations in the US still do, unfortunately. Their ambivalence was grounded more in our own, the US, I'm speaking for US citizens here, in our own long and violent history of intervention in Latin America, and a reluctance to critique even the self-styled left in the current environment of right-wing authoritarian resurgence. More than 2.5 years later, I think that the April insurrection is largely forgotten in the US. Certainly it's not covered in the press, even though in Nicaragua there's no clear end in sight. My work has also shifted with time. I now do collaborative work with Nicaraguan activist scholars to better understand what we found and still find so inspiring and hopeful about the uprising without losing sight of the contradictions that shape political movements in Nicaragua and elsewhere. So just to give you a little bit of background on my own work, I first began working in Nicaragua as a graduate student in 1998. And my last visit to the country was in 2019, in June, a little more than a year after the civic insurrection. Between 2001 and 2004, I lived and worked on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua as an activist researcher, and primarily in the Rama Creole territory with the small Afro-descendant Creole community of Monkey Point. After April 2018, my Nicaraguan research partner, Evelyn Carrasco, and I began to work with participants in the April insurrection, completing 15 in-depth interviews with self-identified autoconvocados living in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and the US. My comments today are, an attempt to bridge these two areas of work, concluding with some thoughts about the possibility for progressive coalitional movements within and beyond Nicaragua. So I'll start by discussing how grassroots social movements for territorial rights on the coast can lend insight into some of the origins of the civic insurrection. And I really enjoyed Christina's presentation talking about feminists, seeing these origins earlier on. For communities like Monkey Point and many of their indigenous neighbors, there's a clear continuity in the forces that drove mobilization against the neoliberal right and those that now drive opposition to the neo-Sandinista left. Although each period has seen distinct geopolitical alliances, state ideologies and agendas, and degrees of official inclusion in the political sphere, certain conditions endure. State violence and land dispossession under mestizo racial rule continue to shape everyday life in indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. I find Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence, or the violence, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, very useful to illustrate the impact of post-war land colonization, deforestation, remilitarization, climate change, and mega project proposals in the Rama Creole territory, all of which, to quote Nixon, have fueled long-term proliferating conflicts in situations where the conditions for sustaining life become increasingly but gradually degraded. This slow violence has continued unabated since the 1990s and contributed to what William Robinson has called the second implosion of Central America. He writes that the revolutions of the 1970s and 80s opened up political systems to electoral competition, but failed to truly democratize or create more egalitarian socioeconomic orders. Meanwhile, capitalist globalization modernized society for some sectors, even as it displaced millions, aggravated poverty, inequality, and social exclusion, and wreaked havoc on the environment. Mega projects like the Interoceanic Grand Canal, which was slated to cut through the center of the Rama Creole territory, are part and parcel of this process of dispossession, even when they don't come to fruition. Successive administrations in Nicaragua have pursued development strategies that sacrifice people and places, in this case, the Rama Creole territory and mestizo communities lining the canal route, in the quest for economic growth. This type of accumulation by dispossession both thrives on and promotes authoritarian relations between citizens and states, and precipitates dispossession for rural and often racialized populations whose lands are targeted for development. In the mid-2000s, the remilitarization of the Caribbean coast to police the drug trade was directly tied to the effort to securitize capitalist intensification in the region. Don Paley calls this phenomenon drug war capitalism to emphasize the relationship between drug war militarism and the expansion of the capitalist system into new or previously inaccessible territories. Starting under the Bolaños administration, the remilitarization of the South Coast resulted in states of exception so routinized that they were unremarkable to those not directly exposed to the violence. For most of Mestizo Nicaragua, these communities represented seditious racial outsiders involved in the drug trade, anti-citizens in heavily securitized zones far from the lived reality of the national majority. Armed occupation, surveillance of community life, excessive use of force, and sexual violence against women, girls, and sometimes men characterized the quotidian workings of the security state in Monkey Point under both Bolaños and Ortega. Similarly, rural mestizo communities involved in the anti-canal campesino movement experienced militarization, criminalization of dissent, and extralegal violence and detention after the current government approved the canal concession in 2013. All of these forms of violence are now painfully familiar to autoconvocados throughout the country who have suffered state repression for their participation in the civic insurrection. So what we see here is not a new state of exception, but one that now includes urban mestizo populations as well. Clearly, there are forces at play that connect these disparate groups in Nicaragua. But what are the possibilities for coalitional solidarity? As a white activist scholar who comes from what I believe to be the most violent and destructive country on earth, I'm centrally concerned with coalitions and how relations of solidarity are built or often frustrated in mass movements for social justice, both nationally and transnationally. When we think about coalitional groups that emerged from the April insurrection, sort of the obvious first one to come to mind is the Civic Alliance for Justice and Democracy. And this was, for those of you who aren't as familiar with Nicaragua, an early opposition coalition that formed to engage the state, made up of representatives from the private sector, civil society groups, the student movement, the campesino movement, and indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. It was really an improvised coalition that had no political precedent or really ideological coherence beyond the demand for democratic reform and an end to the violence. The formation of the Alianza Cívica and its evolution over time represents a shift from what might be viewed as an insurgent, community-based, and for some, prefigurative movement in the streets to an interest group organizational politics, so a different form of politics. For instance, a student activist who attended the first national dialogue told Evelyn and I how disorienting it was to move from insurgent spaces of protest to politicized negotiations with the state. Her heart was with the young people behind the barricades with whom she had an organic solidarity. Coalitional spaces were harder to navigate. Quote, I had to try to understand what my motivations were for being there. What were the motivations of others, she explained. These spaces of insurgent solidarity are precisely what Evelyn and I are most interested in understanding in their great diversity. In an effort to begin to capture the diversity of activism that was so characteristic of the uprising, we have interviewed 7 men, 7 women, and 1 transgender man. Everyone we interviewed was under the age of 30. About half are from Pacific side cities, including 2 from Monimbo in Masaya. 3 are from the Caribbean coast, and 4 are from rural interior regions of the country. 1 is actually a Honduran. 5 are LGBT plus exiles in Costa Rica. 5 identify as members of the student movement, and 2 are participants in the anti-canal campesino movement. And I should say that these identifications, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. They overlap, and people belong to multiple different kinds of groups and categories that I've just listed here. The people we interviewed also come from families with diverse and sometimes mixed political affiliations. A few even said that their families were apolitical or without party affiliation. So it's not really possible to capture the range of perspectives that people shared with us in the little time that I have remaining, but I'll make a few observations that reflect really initial insights from the research, which was still in progress when the pandemic began and it's kind of stopped since the start of the pandemic. Everyone we interviewed described intensely personal experiences of repression and inequality that led them to join the protests in April and May of 2018. For instance, students spoke of scarce funding for higher education and highly politicized and exclusionary university power structures. Many of them have ecological and climate justice commitments that led them to protest the Indio Maíz fire. Mestizo campesinos spoke of their experiences of state repression in response to their mobilization against the Canal Mega Project in the years leading up to the insurrection. A self-identified indigenous mestizo from Monimbo recounted his community's long history of resistance to dictatorship. LGBT plus exiles described heteropatriarchal state that has failed to protect their rights, as well as other diverse motivations for activism. Some of them weren't primarily activists around LGBT issues, but other issues, environmental issues, for instance. Most of all, everyone described the shock and outrage they felt when they saw the government murdering youthful protesters in the street. When the massacre began, many young people responded by affirming the value of their own lives with slogans such as Patria Libre y Vivir, and the feminist version, Matria Libre y Vivir, which represents an effort to reimagine the nation as a space of self and mutual care based in feminist, decolonial, and ecological values. And I should say that Fiore Bran Aragon and I have a forthcoming article that develops this analysis. At the same time, the act of witnessing wanton youth death catalyzed mass demonstrations throughout the country. One young woman from Waslala who supported her community's tranque told me, quote, "I don't care that Daniel won. The problem is that he's killing people. When they started killing, I said, no, you can't. How is it not going to hurt us to see, so many massacred by the government, that it wouldn't hurt us to see them grab children, the youth?" Unquote. Youth life and youth deaths that thus shaped the symbolic foundations of the uprising and played a central role in politicizing the nation. Beyond this, we haven't seen any shared ideological motivations or political affiliations that led Nicaraguans to the streets in such great numbers. If anything, a deep dissatisfaction with electoral politics and political parties, what Ellen Moody calls democratic disenchantment, was more characteristic of the uprising, or at least the folks that we spoke to. Evelina and I also heard many stories about fissures within the resistance movement that are grounded in class, racial, and regional divides. One Creole activist, for instance, applauded and felt very hopeful that Mestizo students in Managua were concerned with Indio maize, but wished that it was also grounded in perhaps a more engaged or real understanding of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities and more active solidarity with these communities. Perhaps the most stunning revelation came from a mestiza from the campesino movement who said that when she was staying in a safe house, she was asked to clean and cook for the household. She had been internally displaced for many months at that point. Pretty much every refugee in Costa Rica that we spoke to felt in some way excluded, abandoned, or misrepresented by the larger resistance organizations that existed there. And many had formed their own groups to represent their interests. The most notable was one created by LGBT plus autoconvocados who offered each other mutual aid and solidarity in exile. So just to conclude, Marina Citrin writes that moments of crisis can generate solidarity and new social relationships as diverse groups mobilize to confront state power. In time, however, these new relationships are co-opted by institutional power and our previous ways of relating can return. We see that happening to some degree in Nicaragua, but we also see so many opportunities for new solidarities and even new transformative visions of the future, often shared by young people, that are important to acknowledge and learn from. And in my view, they're far more valuable signposts for what collectively ails us than the anti-politics of the crisis that is presented by the media or those jockeying for political power. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. And now we'll let Mateo take us home.
Thank you, Kai, and thanks to everybody else. These presentations have been extremely thought-provoking, and I hope that we can open up the discussion soon. What I want to do today is provide my take, a bit of an update on where I think we're at here in Nicaragua politically since 2018 and looking forward to 2021, which is an election year in Nicaragua. But first, I'm a historian. I want to look at the past, but not so much to the ways that the past informs the present, but rather at the ways in which this dislocation, this disruption, this upheaval that we're living through forces us to reframe and indeed relive the past. And so in order to do so, I'm going to share screen. All right, good to go. Because to historicize this moment, I want to share some images from the work of US photojournalist Susan Meiselas, a brilliant documentary photographer. Most of the images are going to come from her book, Nicaragua, which I encourage you to pick up because Meiselas took some of the most iconic photos of the downfall of Nicaragua's Somoza family, a dynastic dictatorship that ruled basically uninterrupted from the 1930s until the late 1970s. And something that's really fascinating about her work is that she manages to capture some themes which I think are universal to a lot of revolutions. For example, that Manichaean quality that turns politics into a struggle between good and evil, and also that special way in which revolutions seem to be able to speed up political time. Those of you who followed the revolution in 1979 may have thought of the old Leninist refrain that there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. But at the same time, Meiselas was able to capture many of the revolution's idiosyncrasies. For example, the importance of Catholicism and liberation theology in particular in overlapping with Marxist ideas about economic redistribution, or the fact that unlike most revolutions in the global South in this period, the Nicaraguan revolution against Somoza enjoyed the support of much of the middle and upper classes. In other words, the Sandinista National Liberation Front was able to lead a socialist revolution by building bridges across society. And most scholars of revolutions would argue that it was this multi-class coalition that was this special ingredient that allowed for a successful revolution in Nicaragua, while most uprisings elsewhere in Latin America and the so-called third world failed. And of course, Meiselas was able to capture the scale of the political violence that sustained the Somoza dictatorship, especially in its final years, as well as the enormous violence that it took to dislodge the Somoza family until the Sandinista National Liberation Front was able to declare victory in July 1979. So what did that victory mean? What did it signify? For Latin America, it was hugely consequential, simply by virtue of the fact that this was the first and only time since the Cuban Revolution that the armed left managed to seize power. So internationally, it was enormously consequential. For many Nicaraguans, 1979 was catharsis. It was the end of a long, dark chapter, but also perhaps the beginning of a new utopian chapter, an opportunity to remake society, to not only destroy the old regime, but to also attack its roots in poverty, in inequality, etc. Now, many of you here are probably familiar with what happened next. The revolutionary process in the 1980s became frustrated sooner rather than later, in part because, like in many revolutions, the old alliance against the old regime collapsed rather quickly after Somoza was defeated, and also because intervention by the United States government militarized grievances with Sandinista rule that, without Washington bullets or dollars, might otherwise have remained in the political sphere. And so that's how the so-called Contra insurgency was born. That's how a second civil war develops in Nicaragua in the 1980s, a war which itself was part of a web of interlocking conflicts across Central America, that pitted Marxist rebels in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador against US anti-communist regimes, US-backed anti-communist regimes in those countries. So there was a hugely devastating war in Nicaragua. It created polarizations which last to this day, and notably, it consumed the FSLN government, derailing its social transformation agenda. And this period of enormous polarization came to an end in a rather surprising way, because as a result of the 1987 Central American Peace Accords, Nicaragua held democratic elections, which the ruling Sandinistas surprisingly lost. And so in 1990, the FSLN became the first socialist movement, which, having come to power by the barrel of the gun, turned it over at the ballot box. And like many Latin American countries in this period, Nicaragua embarked for the very first time on an attempt to create a liberal representative democracy. So let's fast forward. This is a key fact for understanding the sort of relevance of the history of the revolution. And that is the fact that most Nicaraguans were not born until after all of that history I just described. The median age in Nicaragua is around 24 years. And so most people here have no direct experience with or memory of the revolution, the civil war, the transition. And yet, the historical and social memory of that period weighs on us in very profound ways, and in more ways than I can describe here. So for example, in the 2018 popular uprising that has been described already, many Nicaraguans, many young Nicaraguans, look to the past in order to make sense of the authoritarianism and the state violence. As you see in this image, many protesters saw connections between the ways in which the Ortega and Somoza families constructed their respective authoritarian projects. And so since 2018, it's become very commonplace to draw those sort of historical parallels. For example, Yoconda Belli, an influential literary figure and former FSLN cadre, wrote in Foreign Affairs that what never should have happened is happening again in Nicaragua, alluding to a sort of cyclical understanding of how the Somoza dictatorship was reincarnated in a new form. And moreover, there were similarities between the 1979 insurrection and the protest movement of 2018 as well. In fact, our event organizer today, Professor Kai Thaler, actually co-wrote an article analyzing how many anti-Ortega protesters repurposed and repackaged the symbolism and language of the revolution against Ortega. And by the way, I know that Susan Meiselas is thinking about these parallels as well, because she shared this image from social media on her website. But with that said, I think it's actually more interesting to go beyond the parallels and to actually go back and revisit the central questions that we ask ourselves when trying to make sense of these past historical episodes. Because it's just natural that the collapse of the democratic transition of the 90s and the consolidation of a new family dictatorship is going to force us to rethink the history of the Sandinista revolution itself. Now, of course, we don't want to read history backwards. It's simply that it's inevitable as human beings that we're going to ask ourselves how the historical memory of the Nicaraguan revolution takes on a new shape in this new light. We can't run away from that question. And as it happens, Meiselas actually did something along those lines back in 2004 as part of a project called Reframing History, where she went back to Nicaragua to install murals of the photographs she took at the exact locations they were originally taken. As a citizen and as a historian who studies the revolution, I think about that exercise a lot. And for one, and I think Jennifer alluded to this in her presentation, I think one sort of consequence of 2018 is that it highlights the need for researchers to break with the tendency to treat the Sandinista revolution primarily as a flashpoint in the history of US foreign relations. US intervention was a key fact of the revolutionary process in the 1980s, but it was only one element. And of course, it only gets us so far in understanding how Nicaraguan politics has evolved over the past 30 years. I also think that we need to understand political violence in our past in a more holistic fashion. Specifically, we need to refuse the temptation to either romanticize or demonize the Sandinista leadership of the 1980s, and the same goes for their opponents in the Contra. All revolutions, like I said before, have this sort of Manichaean quality. But again, building on something Jennifer said, these binaries of good versus evil, light versus darkness, good versus bad, they're not particularly useful for understanding the past, and even less useful for understanding the contemporary legacies of those episodes. And in particular, I would argue that such binaries obscure deeper dilemmas in our history, such as our historical reliance on all sides of the political spectrum to use political violence or armed violence as a tool for resolving political disagreements, or our inability to reckon with that violence and create justice and accountability for its victims. This is something that I think only today, with the work of people like Emilia, that we're even contemplating this in Nicaragua. Nor do the binaries help us understand our addiction to authoritarian caudillo politics, or do they help us understand the broad suite of social and economic inequalities that the country's ruling elites have left to fester since the first days of the Republic. Those are just some thoughts about that. I hope that we can discuss more during Q&A roundtable. But as promised, I want to provide a quick update on where I think we are, on what we're dealing with today in Nicaragua. I think that Jennifer was absolutely right, that those of us who followed politics here, we've seen our hopes and fears kind of oscillate on a day-to-day basis. But certainly 2 years after the uprising of 2018, it becomes much easier to parse out what the actual political consequences were. What changed and what didn't change in 2018 with the protests and the repression. So on the one hand, I think it's safe to say that 2018 marked the exhaustion and the end of an authoritarian model that existed up to that point. The protests marked the end of what little popular complacency still existed with the Ortega's authoritarian bargain of stability for power. And it also marked the end of key elite alliances with parts of the Catholic Church, and especially with the upper echelon of the economic elite, these elite alliances that had helped sustain the consolidation of the regime to that point. And so together, this state of popular rebellion and the defection of key elite allies definitely put the government against the ropes for a few months. But on the other hand, we can also now say that that crisis didn't actually reflect a terminal crisis of the regime or of FSLN and Orteguista hegemony over the state. And I think that the durability of the regime over the past 2 years can largely be explained by three key things. So number one, the government never really lost its monopoly on violence or territorial control, and it continues to enjoy the support of most of the security apparatus in its repressive strategies. Number two, while the opposition universe has actually become more and more fragmented over the past 2 years, Ortega was able to re-articulate his sort of limited but very durable historic base of support. And number three, even though instability and international sanctions have created a lot of problems for the economy, and there is a deceleration of the economy, Ortega has managed to preserve at least some semblance of macroeconomic stability. And so, to put differently, we can now say, looking back to 2018, that it was not a terminal crisis of the Ortega regime, but rather it was an inflection point that marked the exhaustion of the original model and a transition to a new authoritarian model based on a more limited base of popular support, greater reliance on the repressive apparatus of the state, and a more antagonistic relationship with the country's traditional elite. And so to conclude, where does that leave us moving forward? Given that nobody is contemplating anymore the imminent collapse of the regime or a sudden democratic transition from below, the key question on everybody's mind is what's going to happen next year when presidential elections are scheduled. Now, of course, we haven't had free and competitive elections arguably since 2006, but it's still very important. There's much at stake. On the one hand, for the opposition, it could be an opportunity to galvanize support and to kickstart the unity process and to synchronize efforts to pressure the regime. But by the same token, it's equally possible that the government could take advantage of the elections as another opportunity to further consolidate itself. And so at stake is the legitimacy of the government, the legitimacy of the opposition universe, and the legitimacy of their respective narratives. And all I can say is that the outcome of that battle is likely to set the pace of Nicaraguan politics for many years to come. But we can discuss some more of that now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Mateo, and thanks everyone for sticking with us. Unfortunately, Charlie Hale, in his role as dean, has had to disappear and go off to a budget meeting, trying to make sure we here at UCSB can stay afloat with all of our programs. But I wanted to just turn now straight to the Q&A, and we've had a couple of questions already come up. Anyone in the audience who would like to ask questions, please, you can look for the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type in questions, and then I'll be able to read them out for presenters. So the first question is for Christina from Karen Campworth, who says, thank you for your work, and is interested in some of your thoughts about the figures of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, and especially for Murillo, in terms of what motivates her, to what extent you think that Rosario is sincere in her discourse, and also what some of your impressions are of how she's viewed by Nicaraguans who don't see themselves as feminists, how she's seen by people outside of the feminist movement.
Thank you for that, Kai, and thank you, Professor Campworth, for your comments and questions. I love your work. So I would say that, what motivates, around the figures of Ortega and Murillo, and what motivates Murillo specifically, I think, that's a really interesting question, and something I maybe haven't thought of as deeply, but in a sense, and broadly too, you know, power, because I think we saw this sort of desire for power, you know, back in 1998 when she chose to support Ortega rather than her daughter, Soy la America, and we see like a sort of vying for power and the ability to acquire power through that. I don't think she's necessarily sincere about the like what is in the discourses. I think like that all comes from a sort of study of why it is that, you know, Ortega or the FSLN lost the 1990 election and the sort of subsequent elections, and looking at how it is that they could refashion Ortega quite literally, you know, moving from commander fatigues to a, you know, white button up shirt and a blue jeans or something, presenting a more patriarchal, less combative figure. And so I see the sort of I mean, as many would say, you know, behind this political culture and behind a lot of these discourses is Rosario Murillo. And I think a lot of this sort of ideological renovation that we see amongst the FSLN is based off a study of, you know, why it is that they kept losing. And so there's this ideological project done to not conjure the grief and pain of the red and black, you know, and so appealing to religiosity also comes from recognizing the powerful sorts of bases in society as well, you know, picking up from what's already on the ground and perhaps accentuating it in its own ways. And yeah, I mean, lastly, I'll say in terms of the discourses, the esotericism, I think maybe a lot of I think that, you know, might be quite genuine, and it's interesting to see how like a personal aesthetic gets converted into public policy essentially. And in terms of what people who are not feminists may think of Rosario Murillo, that's an interesting question as well, and one that I think I need to explore. But we can also see, I think, how deep-rooted misogyny comes into the sorts of ways that Murillo is talked about by others. And so I think, you know, we see that in terms of, you know, making fun of like body hair or like calling her things like La Bruja and stuff like that. So, but yeah, interesting question, and one I'll have to think more about. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Then we have a question for Emilia from Daniela Mag. Bien, dice, Emilia, ¿cuál fue la respuesta, si es que existió, del gobierno hacia el museo y AMA en general? ¿Y cuánto duró esta exhibición a la Inca?
Thank you. And I agree with Christina about Rosario. Yeah, she's such a character. But to go to the question, yeah, the government, Tuama, what has been, they haven't been completely like upfront against it, but when the association called for the Mother's March, there was a massacre there. More than around, I think 18 people were killed. So that was I think the most powerful demonstration they did against the association. And then they have done some like more under the radar kind of thing. They raided the president, Francis Valdivia, the president of AMA. Her office was raided at I think by December 2018. And then during the exhibition, we always had cops posted outside, harassing people, because it was also UCA, right? And the UCA is always police. And we did a lot of security protocols for people to enter, give their IDs. We had cameras, all these things. And some of the mothers that have been more vocal, they have also suffered in their kind of like territorial spaces, like one example that comes to my mind is from Jinotepe, Doña Elisa, the tomb of her son, because she was very vocal from the association. The tomb of her son was desecrated. So they do different kind of things, different levels of repression. But basically they haven't put us in jail. That's what I could say about this. And we were very fearful that they would enter the exhibition. That's why we closed it basically in December, because it was when the repression spiked a little, when there was the hunger strike in Masaya, and when they also entered the cathedral in Managua. So there was a point where I said, like, we have to close because we're a target and it's too dangerous. So yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Emilia. So one question, and I'll pose this in part to Jennifer, since you raised the issue of the Maganicas, and if others want to discuss this as well, how you think that events since 2018 have transformed the Nicaraguan right wing, and how the right wing influenced events in 2018, and that's from Victoria Gonzalez Rivera.
You know, that might be a better question for Mateo, honestly. Most of the work that we've done has really been specifically oriented to just everyday people and communities who spontaneously became activists in April and May of 2018, and trying to get at the deeper kind of worldviews and experiences that they had, and sort of their own explanations for what drove them to, you know, fundamentally risk their life and go out into the streets for something that they really believed in at that point. And we purposely haven't talked to political figures or to big name, perhaps leaders in coalitional movements, because we are somewhat less interested in that question. But I can say just that, you know, we did a lot of, we had a lot of discussions with folks about their political leanings and their family's history of affiliation. And most families had histories of affiliation. Some of those folks had family members, you know, a mother that was sort of a militant Sandinista during the 80s and continued to be, or some had, you know, family members who broke with the party and had become sort of disaffected with the party. We did speak to a number of people who were longstanding, from families that were longstanding kind of with liberal affiliations. And one person actually who was like an actual party member, an active party member of the PLC. And we did get a little bit of kind of very familiar anti-communist discourse from those folks. That you see really coming from, you know, I don't personally use the term Maganica, but you see it around, you know, and you certainly do see people who have, you know, I mean, and I should say also that when you're in a really tough situation and you have a government that's very powerful, that's extending sanctions towards the people who have terrorized you for the last couple of years, it's understandable on some level that people will see, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of phenomenon here. So I'm not in any way trying to, you know, cast these individuals necessarily as, you know, right wing or regressive or, you know, Trump lovers or whatever, but you do see a certain kind of sector, I think, of the Nicaraguan right that's consolidated around this sort of affiliation with the US and does reproduce that very typical, very old, very Cold War, very bellicose narrative about how we should make sense of this current moment. But I'd actually, you know, just if I may, you know, ask Mateo to give his thoughts on it, because I suspect he might have, you know, more insights than I do to share. But thank you for the question.
Well, I think it's actually also a great question for Victoria Gonzalez Rivera, who's done a lot of important work on the history of conservatism in Nicaragua. I'll say two things. One, the way in which the Ortega dictatorship consolidated, shifted the center of gravity of Nicaraguan politics way to the right. Because of the nature of the Ortega's relationship with the church, which meant basically abandoning anything except the rhetoric of social progressivism from the 1980s, and the nature of the alliance with the business elite, which wasn't just to accept neoliberalism, but to deepen it, right? And to say we can do neoliberalism, but without liberal democratic institutions. So this is a big context for the uprising in 2018. The fact of the consolidation of the dictatorship neutralized a lot of public policy debates. Those of you who have been coming to Nicaragua for, say, maybe 15 years might remember a time when in newspapers there were debates about, say, what tax policy should look like or how poverty should be reduced. That just doesn't happen anymore in Nicaragua. So I think that's one key context. And the other is the fact that what Ortega did was that he turned first the Catholic Church, but then increasingly the private sector elite into the only interlocutors that existed between his circle and the rest of society. And what happened in 2018 was that, the private sector elite, they broke, with the regime, and they assumed an opposition stance, but they're not accustomed to, suddenly giving up the role that they had as key and sole interlocutors. And so what this means moving forward is that, the private sector, which is enormously influential for many reasons, is always going to look for an opposition vehicle where they can maintain de facto hegemony or at least veto power. I think that's the key thing to look forward to. Perhaps there is the possibility that they'll think more long-term and say, okay, no, we need to share power with all of the organizations that, Cristina and Emilia and Jennifer were describing, the rest of civil society. But I think that it's just very hard to shake those old habits.
Thanks, Mateo. And I think, one of the things that you wrote in your recent Fluxo chapter about the debate on economic models really falling by the wayside for most of the discourse after the 2018 uprisings is very relevant there, that there are actors who want political change, but not a wider societal change. So now I'm going to try to group together questions from Eileen Van Omen, Karen Kampworth, and Christine Hunefeld, who are all curious about everyone on the panel's perspectives about sort of looking forward to the 2021 election, looking at the current constellation of political power in Nicaragua and trying to think about what happens next. How should activists and civil society be organizing or planning? What role, if any, should international actors be playing? And what should the stance of Nicaraguan civil society or activist organizations be around the elections and afterwards? So anyone who wants to jump in can start taking this on.
I can offer, oh, sorry, Cecilia, go ahead.
No, I just want, along with the question, there's one that I think is important to hear me. Okay, Christine Hunefeld asks what, after human rights activists were kicked out and there is a monopoly of violence, what are the warranties of the elections of 2021? And what Nicaraguans expect the US and other Central Americans will do. So I thought that was an important point. And it's along with the other questions that have been asked. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that I would say there are three questions to look for One is related to that. You know, what are the probabilities that we will come to a point where there are even minimal conditions for electoral mobilization? You know, what are the chances that the government will be incentivized or pressured to grant those concessions and make reforms? Because right now, you know, there are none at all. Second question is related to that one. Independent of whether or not there are conditions or not to go to the elections, what are the chances that all of the different actors in the opposition universe will be able to act in a concerted fashion, right? Either we all go into the elections, all go one option, or none of us go. What are the chances of unity? And third, what role will international actors play? You know, we can speculate on this since somebody asked, but you know, the international community will probably play a big role in creating the terms of references for what those conditions look like. You already see this in the Organization of American States. There was already a resolution where they listed out what those conditions would look like. There's also the role of the European Union and the United States in sanctioning officials in the Nicaraguan government. It's unclear exactly what effect that has, but it's a factor. So those three questions, conditions, opposition unity, and the role of the international community is where I would look at.
Emilia or Jennifer, Christina, do any of you have thoughts on, from an activist perspective or otherwise, where things should go?
Well, I can try. Basically, from from the organization that I'm part, I can try to think of. We are more I feel like we have like a longer horizon than the elections. We're thinking more like transitional justice, like basically we have been able to be separated from the implosion that the opposition has been having, but we would support if there would be like a unified effort. But the thing is that there has been a lot of manipulation, basically, I believe, from the government in order for this not to happen on one side, and on the other side, just like power struggles within the opposition. So for us, we see like basically what I think Christina and Jennifer were saying, like there's other type of alliances that we are part of, like the feminist movement has been such an ally to the victims. And a lot of young activists have been saying like, no transitional justice without the feminists, no transitional justice without the victim. So this is kind of like the horizon that I look at, not the 2021 election, because basically nobody knows what's gonna happen and we don't think that elections will happen. And if they happen, they're just gonna be a farce. So we're just working in like a different timeline. Thank you.
Sorry, I guess, yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about that, Emilia. I think one thing too that, I mean, I think about with, you know, the recent elections in the United States and kind of shape also my thinking about elections in other places in Latin America, not just Nicaragua. But this longer horizon that Emilia is talking to, I think is really important because, you know, if by some miracle, there was actually a free and fair election and you know, a coalitional kind of group came into power, I think some important changes would happen. I think, you know, around sort of just the basic rights of liberal citizenship and freedom of speech, freedom of press, the right to not be murdered or to be disappeared or to be put in jail. And I don't want to minimize those things. I mean, for people who are living in this situation, those are intensely important, as are, you know, the points about transitional justice and memory and acknowledging what's happened that Emilia's talked about. But I think that we're also going to be left with many of the same kind of wider structural conditions that, at least in my viewpoint, led us to this point. And I say us because I don't think this is a condition unique to Nicaragua, I think it's a condition that is being experienced around the globe in various different ways with various different consequences. And we see popular uprisings and youth uprisings all over the place in response to these conditions. So in that sense, every country obviously is unique, but Nicaragua is also part of a wider structural phenomenon that people around the world are facing. And I don't believe that any sort of new government that comes into power, as critically as important it is that there is a change, will necessarily in any significant way address the underlying factors, for instance, that have led to just complete total devastation for instance, in indigenous and Afro-descendant communities on the Atlantic coast, or will really change the neoliberal model in any kind of very significant way. And I think one of the things that we found when, just looking at sort of the public discourse around the civic uprising, and also talking to people who, just everyday people, as I said, who participated in tranques and protests and all different kinds of things, most of them also don't have an analysis of those wider factors. I do see it within indigenous and Afro-descendant communities because they're living in the sort of moment of destruction, but it's generally not based in a critique of global capitalism. It's certainly not based in any sort of critique of the US I haven't seen, or the US's role in promoting that global neoliberal model or the IMF or those types of things. So I haven't really seen a very significant structural analysis that will begin to address in a more sort of fulsome and just way the deep kind of underlying structural violence that people in Nicaragua and really all over the world are experiencing right now. And so I think part of my presentation, begins with that discussion because I think it's really critically important to understand that, to make those connections between what people are saying about their experience. And even if they don't in this sort of self-consciously obvious way link them to these wider structural factors, make those linkages because they're there, and people are experiencing those things on the ground. And sometimes they do make the linkages and sometimes they don't, but that doesn't mean that they're not living in the moment of that and really suffering from that and responding to it. So I think that that's just really something important to keep in mind. I don't know where that leaves us, any of us, because we're all, confronting this future together. But yeah.
Christina, have you had any perspectives from the feminist movement that you've heard about planning for the future? And this is obviously for the feminist movement in advocacy against gender-based violence, against femicide, against the government's anti-abortion policies, a long-term struggle. But where do you see that movement heading in the future in Nicaragua?
Yeah, I think in relation to these upcoming elections, I personally am rather pessimistic on two fronts. One being this notion of kind of like unity at all costs. And I think, the sort of ideological diversity of the opposition movement has meant that there isn't like a cohesive, like alternative to like an alternative, a consensus around an alternative project for the state. And so one of the concerns I think is like when there's unity at all costs, what is left out or left behind. And I think that is one of the concerns that of feminists, that these long-term struggles, like as Amelia has pointed to, this like broader, longer horizon, like can get left out of the picture. And so that I think is one of the concerns. And I think we see that a response to that, and again, in this like real sort of focus on visibilization of women's participation, the calling out of like machismo in the unity movement. I see like images of like women carrying like banners that say like lo azul y blanco no te quita el machismo, like being white and blue, you know, of this unity movement doesn't remove your machismo. And so I think that is, yeah, like a response to this sort of issue of unity at all costs, that, you know, may be something to think about as we approach the 2021 elections. And I think the other thing in relation to is like, because of this sort of ongoing global pandemic and that is increasing economic retraction and the lack of sort of, or like the sort of absence of a discourse or program around that focuses on economy as like, and structural changes, as both Mateo and Jennifer alluded to. I think like, for me, I kind of see as like any result, which I think it'll, if there are elections, it'll, you know, go to Ortega. But in either case, like, I think the prescription is more neoliberalism, because just a worsening situation and the lack of a cohesive project that is calling out or confronting and presenting alternatives to the current economic model. So.
Thanks, Christina. I had a question as well for Emilia, as you were discussing some of the experiences of families who were affected by the repression and these conditions of burials in secret, pressure from the government to hide bodies. This has many parallels to what's been happening with the COVID-19 pandemic and express burials, the government hiding numbers of cases and deaths. Can something like the Museo be a model for preserving memory and for some degree of accountability for the government's mismanagement of the pandemic?
Wow. This reminds me of a conversation we had with a Guatemalan journalist, that he said that in Guatemala, the burials brought up a lot of that trauma in the population from the genocide that happened there, right? And in Nicaragua, the thing is that everything has been so close. Like, we had the massacres, and then we have pandemic, and then hurricane, and like, people, I don't think anybody has been able to process all the things that we have been living through. And I imagine that could be an option. It really hurts me, the fact that we don't know how many people actually died from the COVID, and there hasn't been any type of response or any type of, we don't know, we just kind of heard a lot of rumors. But I think there should be some type of memorialization for the people that died from COVID. I think in the US, there has been some people trying to do this type of projects. And I think in Nicaragua, there should be one, but I imagine that it also would be so hard to get that information right now. The only thing that comes to my mind that have been tracking a lot of this is the observatory, the COVID citizen observatory, that they have, I think, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times the number of cases that the government has reported of deaths. Or no, maybe more, I don't know, like 10 times. And I think they have been doing a really good job, and they could maybe in the future do something with this information, because they also, I know that there's a lot of activists there that were also monitoring the political prisoners. So there's that type of activism that is kind of like data related, that I think in the future we'll see how that evolves.
Thanks. So we're running towards the end of time, and possibly over time for some people, but I wanted to thank all of our panelists so much for joining and for wonderful presentations and responses in the Q&A. I want to thank all of our audience for being here with us, and Lisa McAllister for helping us facilitate this, Cecilia Mendez and LAIS for helping put this on, and Cecilia wanted to make a couple announcements before we all take off.
Yes, I just wanted to thank everybody. This was amazing. The panelists were just like, I couldn't hope for anything better. I really appreciate your presentations. And I want to invite everybody to visit our Facebook page. Lisa is going to send right now, if you can, Lisa, please, the link for our Facebook page, because that's where you will find a recording of this event and the recording of our previous events. There is a very close link between the presentation here and the previous one that was in Bolivia and Chile. And just make me think in terms of our reflection, an overall reflection, how this so-called pink tide turned very bleak. Because as you were guys talking about Nicaragua, I couldn't help thinking of all these governments of Chavez and in Ecuador and in Bolivia, all what happened, right? All these hopes, it turned out to be something very dark and very serious. So in the previous Tertulia, Maria Galindo from Bolivia said, it looks like the political party form has reached its end, and we should think of different ways to, different ways in which to participate in politics, which is precisely the ways that you guys in this panel have explained, because nobody seems to have any hope anymore in a political party. But there's hope in different places. So I think the hope doesn't end with that. So I encourage you to visit our Facebook page, our YouTube channel that Lisa is sending the information. And also we have a Twitter account, and please follow up us to see what we have ahead and